Margaret Williams had been living in the same quiet neighborhood for almost 15 years. Every morning she would wake up at 6, make breakfast for her teenage daughter Keisha, and head to her job as a social worker at the county office. Her life was simple but fulfilling. She helped families in crisis, worked long hours, and came home tired but satisfied. Margaret believed in making a difference, even if it was just one person at a time. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September when Margaret first noticed the boy. She was coming home from work, carrying grocery bags, when she saw him sitting on the curb across from her apartment building. He looked small for his age, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with thin arms and clothes that seemed too big for his body. His head was down and he was drawing patterns in the dirt with a stick. Something about the way he sat there so still and alone made Margaret pause. She didn't approach him that day. She just watched from a distance, wondering where his parents were. The next day he was there again. Same spot, same position, like he was waiting for something or someone. Margaret noticed his shirt had stains on it, and his shoes were worn out with holes in the sides. This time she almost walked over to him, but a neighbor called her name and distracted her. By the time she looked back, the boy was gone. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret saw him almost every afternoon. He became part of the landscape of her routine. She would drive past him on her way home, and there he would be, always alone, always quiet. Sometimes he would have a backpack next to him, suggesting he came straight from school. Other times he had nothing at all. Margaret's professional instincts started to kick in. She had seen enough neglected children in her career to recognize the signs, but she also knew that jumping to conclusions could make things worse. One evening, Margaret came home later than usual. It had been raining all day, one of those heavy autumn rains that soaked through everything. The streets were empty and the sky was dark gray. As she pulled into her parking spot, she noticed a small figure huddled under the building's entrance awning. Her heart sank. It was the boy, sitting with his knees pulled up to his chest, shivering in the cold. His clothes were drenched and his hair was plastered to his forehead. Margaret grabbed her umbrella and walked over to him. As she got closer, she could see him more clearly. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old. His face was pale and his lips had a slight blue tint from the cold. When he heard her footsteps, he looked up with wide, frightened eyes like a deer caught in headlights. Margaret's heart broke right there. She knelt down slowly, keeping her distance so she wouldn't scare him. Her voice was soft and gentle. "Hey there, sweetheart. You look cold. Are you okay?" The boy didn't answer. He just stared at her with those big, haunted eyes. Margaret noticed his hands were trembling, and not just from the cold. There was something deeper. Something that made him look like he was expecting the worst. She tried again. "My name is Margaret. I live right here in this building. I've seen you around here before. What's your name?" Still nothing. The boy looked down at his shoes, avoiding eye contact. Margaret could see the fear radiating from him. She had worked with enough traumatized children to know that pushing too hard would only make him retreat further. Instead of asking more questions, Margaret stood up and said, "I'll be right back. Don't go anywhere, okay?" She hurried up to her apartment, grabbed a thick blanket from her closet, and made a cup of hot chocolate. When she came back down, she was relieved to see the boy was still there. She sat down a few feet away from him and placed the steaming cup between them. "I made this for you," she said simply. "It's hot chocolate. It'll warm you up." The boy glanced at the cup, then at Margaret, suspicion written all over his face. He didn't move. Margaret wrapped the blanket around her own shoulders and took a sip from her own cup she had brought. "See, it's safe. I'm drinking the same thing." She smiled at him, the kind of warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes. Several minutes passed in silence. Then slowly the boy reached for the cup. His hands were shaking so badly that hot chocolate sloshed over the rim. He took a small sip, then another. Margaret watched as some color returned to his cheeks. She didn't say anything, just sat there with him in comfortable silence, sharing the shelter of the awning while rain poured down around them. After finishing half the cup, the boy finally spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. "My name is Daniel." Margaret felt a small victory in her chest. "That's a beautiful name," she said. "Daniel, do your parents know where you are?" His whole body tensed at the question. His eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them away quickly like he had learned not to cry. "My mom's at work," he mumbled. "She works until late. She doesn't know I'm here." Margaret nodded slowly. "And your dad?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He's not my dad. He's my stepdad, and I can't go home when he's there. The way he said it made Margaret's stomach drop. The fear in his voice, the way he flinched just mentioning the man, told her everything she needed to know. She wanted to ask more, wanted to understand the full situation, but she could see Daniel was already shutting down. His shoulders had hunched forward and he was pulling away from her emotionally. Margaret knew she had to be patient. "Tell you what," she said gently. "It's cold and wet out here. How about you come up to my apartment? You can get warm and dry, maybe have some dinner. My daughter Keisha is home and we're having spaghetti. You like spaghetti?" Daniel looked uncertain, torn between fear and the offer of warmth and food. Margaret could see him struggling with the decision. Finally, he nodded, just a tiny movement of his head. Margaret stood up slowly and offered her hand. Daniel stared at it for a long moment before placing his small, cold hand in hers. As they walked up the stairs to her apartment, Margaret noticed something that made her blood run cold. When Daniel lifted his arm to push his wet hair back, his sleeve rode up. There on his forearm were dark purple bruises in the distinct shape of finger marks. Someone had grabbed him hard enough to leave those marks. Margaret's professional training told her to stay calm, to not react in a way that would scare the boy. But inside, her heart was racing with anger and sadness. That evening, Daniel sat at Margaret's small kitchen table, wrapped in a dry blanket, eating spaghetti like he hadn't seen food in days. Keisha, Margaret's 15-year-old daughter, watched him with curiosity but didn't ask questions. She had grown up with a mother who brought work home sometimes, who cared deeply about helping people. She understood without being told that this boy needed kindness, not interrogation. As Daniel ate, Margaret watched him carefully. She noticed how he flinched when she moved too quickly, how he kept his eyes on the door, like he expected someone to burst through it at any moment, how he ate quickly, protectively, like the food might be taken away. Every behavior told a story, and Margaret had read too many of these stories in her career. After dinner, Margaret called the number Daniel gave her for his mother. A tired-sounding woman answered. Margaret explained who she was and that Daniel was safe with her. The woman, who introduced herself as Patricia, sounded relieved and apologetic. She explained she worked double shifts at a nursing home and wouldn't be home until 11. She thanked Margaret repeatedly for taking care of her son. Margaret wanted to ask about the bruises, about the stepfather, about why an 8-year-old was wandering the streets alone. But she knew this wasn't the time. Patricia sounded exhausted and overwhelmed, not cruel or neglectful. Margaret had a feeling she didn't know what was happening in her own home. That night, Daniel fell asleep on Margaret's couch, still wrapped in the blanket. Margaret sat in her chair watching him sleep. His face finally relaxed, looked even younger. She thought about all the children she had helped through the system, all the cases she had worked. But something about Daniel was different. Maybe it was because she had found him on her own doorstep. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, or maybe it was simply that her heart had chosen him. Margaret made a decision that night. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do, but she knew she couldn't just walk away from this child. Daniel needed someone to fight for him, someone to see him and protect him. And Margaret, despite the complications it would bring to her own life, despite the professional boundaries she might be crossing, knew that someone had to be her. The next morning, Margaret woke Daniel early and made him breakfast. Scrambled eggs, toast, and orange juice. Simple food, but Daniel ate it like it was a feast. Margaret watched him carefully, noticing how he kept looking at her as if waiting for her mood to change, for kindness to turn into something else. She recognized that look. It was the look of a child who had learned that good moments never lasted. Before Daniel left for school, Margaret knelt down to his level and looked him in the eyes. "Daniel, I want you to know something. After school today, instead of sitting outside alone, you come straight to my apartment. Knock on my door. I'll be home by 4:30, and if I'm not, my daughter Keisha will be here. You understand?" Daniel nodded slowly, still unsure if this was real. Margaret squeezed his shoulder gently. "You're safe here. Remember that." That afternoon at exactly 4:15, there was a soft knock on Margaret's door. When she opened it, Daniel stood there with his backpack, looking nervous but hopeful. Margaret smiled wide and welcomed him in. This became their routine. Every day after school, Daniel would come to Margaret's apartment. She would give him snacks, help him with his homework, and just let him be a kid for a few hours. Sometimes they would watch television together. Sometimes Daniel would draw pictures while Margaret prepared dinner. The routine gave him something he had never really had before: stability. As weeks passed, Daniel began to open up. Small pieces of his story came out, never all at once, but in fragments. His mother, Patricia, worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes more, trying to keep them afloat financially. His stepfather, a man named Frank, had seemed nice at first, but after he moved in, everything changed. Frank had a temper that exploded without warning. A broken glass, a noise during his favorite television show, dinner not ready on time, anything could set him off. Daniel told Margaret about the punishments. Being locked in his room for hours. Being denied meals. The hitting started small, a slap here and there, but it had gotten worse. Frank was careful, though. He never hit Daniel's face. Always the arms, the back, the legs, places that could be hidden under clothes. Daniel's mother worked so much that she rarely saw her son without a shirt on. She had no idea what was happening in her own home. One evening, about 3 weeks after that rainy night, Daniel showed up at Margaret's door earlier than usual. It was only 2 in the afternoon. His face was streaked with tears, and when he turned around to close the door behind him, Margaret saw something that made her gasp. His shirt had ridden up, and across his lower back were 3 circular burns, red and blistered. Cigarette burns. Fresh ones. Margaret's hands shook as she gently lifted Daniel's shirt. There were more, some old and scarred, some new. Her vision blurred with angry tears, but she forced herself to stay calm. Daniel was already scared enough. She carefully cleaned and bandaged the burns, talking softly to him the whole time, telling him he was brave, telling him this wasn't his fault. After she finished, she held him while he cried. Not the quiet tears of someone afraid to make noise, but real, deep sobs, the kind that come when someone finally feels safe enough to break down. That night, after Daniel's mother picked him up, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. Keisha sat across from her. "Mom, you have to report this." "You know you do." Margaret nodded. She did know. As a social worker, she was a mandatory reporter. But she also knew what happened next. Daniel would be removed from his home immediately. He would be placed in emergency foster care, probably with strangers. He might end up separated from his mother, the one person who loved him even if she didn't know how to protect him. The system, despite everyone's best intentions, was broken and overwhelmed. Margaret had seen too many children lost in that system. Moved from home to home, never finding stability, aging out at 18 with nothing and no one. The thought of that happening to Daniel made her physically ill. "What if," Margaret said slowly, looking at her daughter, "what if I became his foster parent?" Keisha's eyes widened. "Mom, we barely have enough room as it is. Money is already tight. And you know how hard foster certification is." Margaret did know. She knew all the paperwork, the home inspections, the background checks, the financial requirements. She knew that as a single mother already raising one child, taking in another, would stretch her to her absolute limit. But she also knew that Daniel trusted her, that he had finally found someone safe. Moving him to a stranger's house would feel like another betrayal to him. "I have to try," Margaret said. "I can't just hand him over to the system and hope for the best." The next day, Margaret called Child Protective Services and filed a formal report. She detailed everything Daniel had told her and provided photographs of his injuries that she had carefully documented. She also immediately applied to become an emergency foster parent, requesting Daniel specifically. The social worker on the other end of the phone warned her that the process would be complicated, that there were no guarantees, that she shouldn't get her hopes up. What followed were the hardest 2 months of Margaret's life. Child Protective Services removed Daniel from his home within 24 hours. Frank was arrested and charged with child abuse. Patricia, devastated and guilt-ridden, didn't fight the removal. She knew her son needed to be safe, even if it meant losing him temporarily. Daniel was placed in emergency foster care with a family across town, while Margaret's application was processed. During those 2 months, Margaret was allowed supervised visits with Daniel. She would drive across town twice a week to see him at the CPS office. Each visit broke her heart a little more. Daniel had shut down again. The light that had started to come back into his eyes was gone. He barely spoke, barely ate. The foster family he was with were good people, but they had 3 other foster children. Daniel was just another case to them. He slept on a couch in their living room and had no space that was his own. Margaret fought through the bureaucracy like a woman possessed. She filled out endless forms. She took time off work for home inspections and interviews. She attended mandatory training sessions on foster parenting. She provided financial records, character references, and medical clearances. Her savings account dwindled as she paid for the required certifications and prepared her apartment to meet safety standards. She installed safety locks on cabinets, covered electrical outlets, and created a proper bedroom for Daniel by converting her small home office. Her neighbors and some family members questioned her decision. "Why are you doing this?" they asked. "He's not your responsibility. You already have your own daughter to worry about." Some people in her community were more direct. "Girl, you're crazy. Taking in someone else's damaged child? He's going to have problems. Trauma like that doesn't just go away." The criticism hurt, but Margaret pushed through it. She had made up her mind. Keisha, despite her initial concerns, became Margaret's biggest supporter. She helped convert the office into a bedroom, painting the walls a cheerful blue and helping pick out a bed and decorations. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right," Keisha said. She had seen Daniel during those early visits, had watched him help with homework and laugh at silly television shows. She understood why her mother cared so much. Finally, after 2 months of waiting, fighting, and praying, Margaret got the call. Her application had been approved. Daniel could come home. "Not permanently yet," the social worker explained. This was temporary custody while the courts worked through Patricia's case. But he could come home. Margaret cried with relief. She called Patricia first to tell her the news. Patricia cried too, thanking Margaret over and over. She knew her son would be safe and loved. The day Daniel moved in was a Saturday in late November. Margaret and Keisha drove to the foster home to pick him up. When Daniel saw Margaret walking up the driveway, something shifted in his face. Hope flickered back to life. Margaret opened her arms and Daniel ran into them, holding on like he would never let go. "You came back," he whispered. "You really came back." Margaret's voice was thick with emotion. "I told you, baby. You're safe with me. Always." They drove back to the apartment, and when Margaret opened the door to Daniel's new room, he stood in the doorway, stunned. The walls were painted his favorite color. There was a bed with a warm comforter, a desk for homework, shelves for books and toys. Keisha had even put up posters of superheroes on the walls. It was small, but it was his own space, his own safe place. That night, Margaret made Daniel's favorite meal, spaghetti again, and they ate together as a family. Keisha told jokes that made Daniel laugh, really laugh, for the first time in months. After dinner, Margaret tucked Daniel into his new bed. As she turned to leave, Daniel's small voice stopped her. "Miss Margaret?" She turned back. "Will you stay until I fall asleep? I don't like being alone in the dark." Margaret smiled, pulled up a chair next to his bed, and took his hand. "I'll stay as long as you need me to." As Daniel drifted off to sleep, Margaret looked at the small boy who had somehow become hers. She thought about the sacrifices ahead, the financial strain, the emotional challenges. She thought about the criticism from people who didn't understand. But then she looked at Daniel's peaceful face, finally relaxed in sleep, and knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. Some things in life were worth fighting for. Some children were worth everything you could give, and Daniel was one of them. The first few months with Daniel were harder than Margaret had anticipated. The physical bruises healed, but the emotional scars ran deep. Daniel had nightmares almost every night. He would wake up screaming, disoriented and terrified. Margaret would rush into his room, turn on the lights, and hold him until the shaking stopped. Sometimes it took hours before he could fall back asleep. During the day, Daniel was jumpy and anxious. Loud noises made him freeze in place. If someone raised their voice, even in laughter, he would flinch and duck his head. He hoarded food in his room, hiding crackers and fruit under his bed, terrified that meals might be taken away. Margaret never scolded him for this. Instead, she gently reassured him that there would always be food, that he never had to worry about going hungry again. Margaret took Daniel to therapy twice a week. At first, he refused to talk to the therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Chen. He would sit in the chair, arms crossed, staring at the floor in stubborn silence. But Dr. Chen was patient. She gave Daniel coloring books and art supplies, let him draw instead of talk. Slowly, over weeks and months, Daniel began to express through his artwork what he couldn't say with words. His drawings were dark at first, filled with shadows and scary figures. But gradually, bits of color started appearing. A yellow sun, a blue house, stick figures holding hands. Margaret attended every therapy session, learning how to help Daniel heal. Dr. Chen taught her about trauma responses, about triggers, about the long road ahead. Healing isn't linear, Dr. Chen explained. There will be good days and bad days, progress and setbacks. What matters most is consistency. Daniel needs to know that no matter what, you're not going anywhere. And Margaret wasn't going anywhere. She rearranged her work schedule to be home when Daniel got out of school. She turned down overtime opportunities. Even though money was tight, she made sure she was at every parent-teacher conference, every school event, every moment that mattered. Daniel's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, noticed the changes in him. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it," she told Margaret. "Daniel is like a different child. He's participating in class now, making friends. Last week he actually smiled during recess." Those small victories meant everything to Margaret. The first time Daniel laughed at one of Keisha's jokes without that guarded, uncertain look. The first time he asked for seconds at dinner without fear. The first morning he woke up and didn't immediately check to make sure Margaret was still there. Each moment was proof that love and safety could heal even the deepest wounds. Keisha surprised everyone with how naturally she took to being a big sister. She helped Daniel with his reading, played video games with him, and defended him fiercely at school when kids asked nosy questions about why he lived with them. One afternoon, Margaret overheard them talking in Daniel's room. "Do you think of Miss Margaret as your mom?" Keisha asked. There was a long pause. Then Daniel's quiet voice, "Is it okay if I do? I mean, I have a real mom, but Miss Margaret is the one who's here, who tucks me in, who makes me feel safe." Keisha's response was immediate. "Of course it's okay. And that makes me your real sister then, right?" Daniel's delighted "Really?" made Margaret's eyes fill with tears. Life settled into a new rhythm. Margaret stretched every dollar to cover 3 people instead of 2. She shopped at thrift stores, clipped coupons, and took on occasional freelance consulting work on weekends. Her savings account was nearly empty, but her home was full of something more valuable than money. It was full of laughter, of healing, of family. Then, just as things seemed to be stabilizing, everything changed. It was a Tuesday afternoon, almost 3 years after Daniel had first come to live with them. Daniel was now 11 years old, doing well in school, and had even joined the school art club. Margaret had just picked him up from practice when her phone rang. It was Patricia, Daniel's biological mother. Patricia's voice was different, stronger, more present. She explained that she had left Frank 2 years ago, right after his arrest. She had been attending therapy, working on herself, understanding how she had failed to protect her son. She had a stable job now as a nursing supervisor. She had her own apartment, and she wanted her son back. She was filing for reunification. Margaret's world tilted. She sat down heavily on the couch, trying to keep her voice steady. "Patricia, I understand. I really do. But Daniel is doing so well here. He's stable, he's happy, he's healing. Moving him now." Patricia's voice was firm but emotional. "He's my son, Margaret. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes. But I've changed. I've done everything the court asked. I've completed parenting classes, stayed in therapy, maintained stable employment and housing. I deserve a chance to be his mother again." Legally, Patricia was right. She had fulfilled all the requirements for reunification. The whole point of the foster system was to reunite children with their biological parents when it was safe to do so. Margaret knew this. She had advocated for this very thing countless times in her professional life. But this wasn't a case file. This was Daniel. This was her boy. That evening, Margaret sat Daniel down and tried to explain what was happening. His face went pale. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, I don't want to go. This is my home. You're my family." Margaret's heart shattered into pieces. She pulled him close. "Baby, I know this is scary, but your mom loves you. She's been working really hard to make a safe home for you. The court thinks it's time for you two to be together again." Daniel pulled away, anger flashing in his eyes for the first time since Margaret had known him. "You're giving up on me, just like everyone else." He ran to his room and slammed the door. Margaret sat there, tears streaming down her face. Keisha came and sat beside her, putting her head on her mother's shoulder. Neither of them knew what to say. The court hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Margaret hired a lawyer with money she didn't have, but the lawyer was honest with her. "Unless you can prove Patricia is unfit, which by all accounts she isn't, the court will rule in favor of reunification. Biology matters in these cases." "I'm sorry." Margaret attended the hearing with Daniel. Patricia was there too, looking nervous but determined. The judge reviewed all the evidence. Patricia's clean record over the past 2 years, her stable employment, her therapy progress reports, letters of recommendation from her employer and therapist. Then the judge turned to Daniel. "Young man, I understand you're happy where you are, but your mother has done everything asked of her. She deserves a chance to be your parent again. Sometimes the right thing doesn't feel good at first, but it's still right." Daniel testified, his voice shaking but clear. "Miss Margaret saved my life. She's the only person who ever really took care of me. Please don't make me leave her." Margaret watched from the gallery, tears running down her face. But even Daniel's plea wasn't enough. The judge ruled in favor of gradual reunification. Daniel would begin weekend visits with Patricia immediately, transitioning to full custody in 3 months. The next few months were agony. Every Friday, Patricia would pick Daniel up for the weekend. Every Sunday, he would come back to Margaret quieter and more withdrawn. He stopped talking as much. His nightmares came back. He started hoarding food again. Margaret tried to stay positive, tried to help him adjust, but watching him regress broke her heart daily. The final day came too quickly. Patricia arrived with a borrowed truck to collect Daniel's belongings. Margaret had packed everything carefully, including all his artwork, his favorite books, his stuffed bear that he slept with every night. Daniel moved through the apartment like a ghost, not really seeing anything. Keisha hugged him tight, crying openly. "You're still my brother," she told him. "That doesn't change." Before Daniel left, Margaret gave him a small journal with a leather cover. Inside the front page, she had written her phone number and address. "No matter where you go, no matter what happens, you can always reach me. You will always have a home here, always. Do you understand?" Daniel nodded, clutching the journal to his chest. "I love you, Miss Margaret." His voice broke on the words. Margaret knelt down and cupped his face in her hands. "I love you too, baby, so much. And I'm so proud of you. You're the bravest person I know." She watched from the window as Patricia's truck pulled away. Daniel's small face pressed against the glass, watching her until the truck turned the corner and disappeared. Margaret stood there for a long time, even after the truck was gone. Finally, she walked into Daniel's empty room. The blue walls seemed too bright now. The bed too neat. The shelves too bare. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself fall apart completely. That night, Margaret lay awake wondering if she had made any difference at all. Daniel was gone, back into a situation that might be better, might be stable, but might not be. She had given 3 years of her life, emptied her savings, poured her heart into this child. And for what? To have him torn away. She thought about his face in the truck window, the fear and sadness in his eyes. She questioned everything. Had she fought hard enough? Should she have done more? The questions haunted her as darkness filled the room. In his new bedroom across town, Daniel lay awake too, clutching the journal Margaret had given him. He opened it to the first page and traced her handwriting with his finger. Her phone number, her address, her promise. "You will always have a home here, always." He closed his eyes and tried to believe it, tried to hold on to the memory of safety, of family, of the 3 years when someone had loved him unconditionally. He didn't know if he would ever see Margaret again, but he knew one thing for certain. She had changed him, and that change was permanent. Daniel tried calling Margaret's number 3 times in the first week. Each time the phone rang and rang with no answer. He didn't know that Patricia had moved them 2 hours away to a different city for her new supervisor position. He didn't know that Margaret's old landline had been disconnected after she finally switched to a cell phone to save money. All Daniel knew was that the one lifeline he had been given wasn't working. After the 3rd failed attempt, he stopped trying. The rejection, even though it wasn't real, felt like another abandonment. Life with Patricia was complicated. She genuinely tried to be a good mother. She made his meals, helped with homework, and kept the apartment clean and safe. There was no violence, no screaming, no fear of being hurt. But there was also a distance between them that hadn't existed before. 3 years was a long time in a child's life. Patricia felt like a stranger trying too hard. Daniel felt like a guest in someone else's home, always careful, always polite, but never truly comfortable. Patricia's work schedule was demanding. She left early in the morning and often came home late in the evening. Daniel would get himself ready for school, ride the bus alone, and spend afternoons by himself in the apartment until she returned. The loneliness was crushing. He missed Margaret's presence when he got home from school. He missed Keisha's terrible jokes and the way she would help him with math homework. He missed family dinners and movie nights. He missed feeling like he belonged somewhere. School became Daniel's escape. He threw himself into his classes, especially art. Drawing had always been his way of processing emotions he couldn't speak out loud. His art teacher, Mr. Patel, noticed his talent and encouraged him to enter school competitions. Daniel won third place in a district-wide art show with a piece he called Home. It was a painting of a small apartment with warm, yellow light pouring from the windows. If you looked closely, you could see 3 figures inside sitting around a table. Mr. Patel asked him about it once. "Is this your home?" Daniel had looked at the painting for a long time before answering. It was. The journal Margaret had given him became his most precious possession. He carried it everywhere, filling page after page with sketches and thoughts. He drew Margaret's face from memory, trying to capture her warm smile. He drew Keisha making funny faces. He drew the blue bedroom that had been his sanctuary, and on the difficult nights when loneliness felt like it would swallow him whole, he would open to the first page and read Margaret's words over and over. "You will always have a home here, always." But as months turned into years, the memory of Margaret began to fade around the edges, like an old photograph left in the sun. Daniel could still remember her voice, her kindness, the feeling of safety she provided. But the details became fuzzy. Had her eyes been dark brown or lighter? What perfume had she worn? What had her laugh sounded like? The fear of forgetting her completely terrified him. When Daniel was 13, Patricia's life unraveled again. She started coming home later and later, sometimes smelling like alcohol. She missed work occasionally. Her temper, never violent like Frank's had been, became short and unpredictable. Daniel learned to stay quiet, to make himself small, to not cause problems. He recognized the signs of his mother slipping backward, and it scared him more than he could admit. One night, Patricia didn't come home at all. Daniel waited up until 2 in the morning before finally falling asleep on the couch. She showed up the next afternoon with no explanation, just dark circles under her eyes and a warning not to tell anyone. Daniel didn't tell. He had learned early in life that sometimes keeping secrets was easier than dealing with the consequences of truth. By the time Daniel turned 16, he had essentially been raising himself for years. He got himself to school, managed his own homework, and even learned to cook basic meals. Patricia's drinking had worsened. She lost her supervisor position and bounced between lower-paying jobs. The apartment that had once been clean and safe became cluttered and chaotic. Daniel kept his room as neat as possible, a small island of order in the disorder around him. The state finally intervened when a teacher noticed Daniel wearing the same clothes for 3 days straight and falling asleep in class. A social worker came to their apartment, took one look at the situation, and made the decision. Patricia was given a choice: voluntary treatment or lose custody again. She chose treatment. Daniel was placed in a group home. The group home was nothing like Margaret's warm apartment. It was institutional and cold, with too many rules and too many kids competing for too little attention. Daniel shared a room with 3 other boys. They had bunk beds with thin mattresses and a single window that looked out at a parking lot. The staff were overworked and tired, doing their best but spread too thin to give any real individual care. Daniel could have given up then. Many kids in his situation did. The statistics were grim for children who aged through the foster system. Homelessness, poverty, incarceration, these were common outcomes, but something inside Daniel refused to surrender. On the hardest nights, he would pull out his journal, now worn and filled with years of drawings and thoughts. He would read Margaret's words on the first page, and he would remember. He remembered Margaret fighting for him. He remembered her working extra hours to provide for him. He remembered Dr. Chen telling him in therapy that his past didn't have to define his future. He remembered Keisha saying he was brave, and he decided that if Margaret had believed in him enough to sacrifice so much, he owed it to her to prove she was right. Daniel got a part-time job at a grocery store, bagging groceries and stocking shelves. He worked every hour he wasn't in school, saving almost every penny. He maintained straight A's despite the chaos of group home life. He applied for every scholarship he could find. His art teacher, Mr. Patel, wrote him a recommendation letter so glowing that Daniel cried when he read it. This young man has overcome obstacles that would break most people. He has talent, determination, and a heart that refuses to become bitter despite every reason to be. When the acceptance letter came from the state university with a full scholarship, Daniel sat on his bunk bed and stared at it for a long time. Full ride, room and board included, a chance at a real future. He thought about calling Margaret to tell her the news. He had tried to find her over the years, but searches on the library computer had turned up nothing. Margaret Williams was too common a name. He didn't know if she still lived in the same place. Didn't know if she even remembered him after all these years. But he wrote her a letter that night, pouring out years of gratitude and updates on his life. He addressed it to her old apartment, knowing it probably wouldn't reach her but needing to write it anyway. He told her about the scholarship, about his plan to study social work, about how everything good in his life could be traced back to those 3 years with her. He sealed the envelope and dropped it in the mailbox the next morning. It came back 2 weeks later, returned to sender, address unknown. Daniel started university that fall with 2 suitcases, $700 in savings, and a worn journal. His roommate was a kid from a wealthy suburb who complained about his parents being too strict. Daniel said nothing, just unpacked his few belongings and got to work. He took 18 credit hours, worked 20 hours a week in the campus library, and volunteered at a youth center on weekends. College was harder than he expected. Not the academics, those came easily, but the social part. Everyone around him seemed to have families they called on weekends, parents who sent care packages, homes to return to during breaks. Daniel had none of that. During Thanksgiving and Christmas breaks, when the dorms closed, he couch-surfed with acquaintances or picked up extra shifts at work to afford a cheap motel room. But he persisted. He joined the social work program in his sophomore year and discovered his calling. In his classes, when they talked about trauma-informed care, about the impact of stability on child development, about the importance of one caring adult in a child's life, Daniel saw his own story reflected back. He understood these concepts not just intellectually but in his bones. He had lived them. His professors noticed his unique perspective. One of them, Dr. Bennett, pulled him aside after class one day. "You have something most social workers take years to develop, true empathy born from experience. Whatever you've been through, it's given you a gift. Don't waste it." Daniel didn't waste it. He excelled in his field placements, working with foster children and watching himself in their scared eyes and defensive postures. During his junior year, Daniel started dating a woman named Rachel from his research methods class. She was kind and patient, never pushing when he got quiet about his past. Their first real fight came when she wanted him to meet her parents. "I don't understand why you're so nervous," she said. "They're going to love you." How could he explain that meeting parents terrified him? That he had no frame of reference for normal family dynamics? That he was afraid her parents would take one look at him and see all his damage? But he went. Rachel's parents were warm and welcoming, and their house was everything Daniel had dreamed homes could be. Full of laughter and photos and the smell of home-cooked food. Sitting at their dinner table, Daniel felt a sharp ache in his chest. He excused himself to the bathroom and stood there, staring at his reflection, trying to breathe through the wave of grief. Grief for the childhood he never had. Grief for Margaret and the family he had lost. Grief for all the years in between. Rachel found him there and held him while he cried. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. "I'm sorry." She just held him tighter. "You have nothing to be sorry for." That night, Daniel told her everything. About Frank, about Margaret, about the years of instability. Rachel listened without judgment, and when he finished, she said something that changed everything. "You need to find her. This Margaret. You need to find her and tell her what she meant to you." Daniel had thought about finding Margaret countless times over the years. But fear always stopped him. Fear that she had forgotten him. Fear that seeing him would be an unwelcome reminder of a difficult time in her life. Fear that the woman who had saved him wouldn't want to be found. But Rachel's words planted a seed. What if Margaret wondered about him too? What if she wanted to know that her sacrifice had mattered? What if she needed to know that he was okay? That night, Daniel opened his journal to a fresh page and began making a plan. He was 23 years old now, in his senior year of college. He had survived things that should have broken him. He had made something of himself against impossible odds. And he owed so much of that to a woman who had taken him in when she didn't have to, who had loved him when he was unlovable, who had shown him what family could be. It was time to find Margaret Williams. It was time to say thank you. It was time to show her that her 3 years hadn't been wasted. That the boy she had saved had grown into a man who wanted to save others. It was time to go home. Finding Margaret turned out to be much harder than Daniel expected. He started with internet searches, but there were hundreds of Margaret Williams in the state alone. He tried social media, scrolling through profile after profile, but none of the faces matched the woman from his memory. He contacted the county social services office where she had worked, but they cited privacy policies and couldn't give him any information. Daniel spent his Christmas break that year making phone calls. He called every Margaret Williams listed in the phone book for the county where he had lived with her. Most numbers were disconnected. A few were answered by women who had never heard of him. One elderly Margaret listened to his story and cried, saying she wished she had been the one to help him, but she wasn't. After 3 weeks of dead ends, Daniel almost gave up. Then he remembered Keisha. Margaret's daughter would be in her 30s now. He searched for her instead, using the yearbook from the local high school library's online archives. There she was, Keisha Williams, 2 years before he had come to live with them. With her full name and graduation year, he found her on social media within an hour. His hands shook as he typed out a message. "Hi, Keisha. You probably don't remember me. My name is Daniel. I lived with you and your mom when I was 8 years old. I've been trying to find Margaret to thank her for everything she did for me. If you get this message and are willing to help, please let me know." He hit send and waited. 1 day passed. Then 2, then a week. Daniel checked his messages obsessively, hope fading with each empty notification. Maybe Keisha had changed her privacy settings and never saw the message. Maybe she did remember him and wanted nothing to do with that painful chapter of her life. Maybe he was chasing a ghost of the past that was better left alone. Then, on a Tuesday evening while Daniel was studying for his final exams, his phone buzzed with a new message. His heart stopped when he saw the name. Keisha Williams. The message was short but warm. "Oh my God, Daniel. Of course I remember you. You were my little brother. Mom talks about you all the time. She never stopped wondering what happened to you. Call me." She included her phone number. Daniel's vision blurred with tears. Margaret talks about him. She never stopped wondering. All these years he thought she had probably forgotten him, moved on with her life. The possibility that she had remembered, that she had cared all this time, overwhelmed him. He waited until he could trust his voice, then dialed the number. Keisha answered on the second ring. "Daniel?" Her voice was older but still familiar. "Is it really you?" They talked for 2 hours. Keisha told him about her life, her husband, her 2 kids. She told him about Margaret, who was now 68 years old and had retired from social work 5 years ago. She told him Margaret had kept his room exactly as it was for almost a year after he left, hoping he might come back. That she had tried to get updates on him through her contacts at social services, but was always told privacy laws prevented them from sharing information. "She never remarried," Keisha said quietly. "After Dad died when I was little, and then after you left, I think she just poured everything into her work. She helped so many other kids over the years. But you were different. You were family. She has your drawings framed on her walls, Daniel. Every single one you made for her." Daniel couldn't speak for a moment. Finally, he managed to ask, "Does she still live in the same place?" Keisha hesitated. "She does, actually. Same apartment building." "Can you believe that?" "She always said she stayed because she wanted to be there in case you ever came looking for her. Daniel, I think you should visit her. Soon. She's not sick or anything, but she's getting older. And I think she needs to see you as much as you need to see her." They made a plan. Keisha would visit her mother that weekend and casually mention that she had heard from an old friend. She would prepare Margaret, make sure the surprise wouldn't be too much of a shock. Then Daniel would come the following Saturday. He had 1 semester left before graduation, and he used every penny of his savings to buy a plane ticket home. The week before the visit felt like the longest of Daniel's life. He was finishing his final semester while also applying for social work positions. He had been accepted into a master's program with a full scholarship and had deferred it for a year so he could work and save money. But none of that seemed to matter compared to seeing Margaret again. Rachel helped him shop for new clothes. "You want to look successful," she said, picking out a nice shirt and slacks. "You want her to see the man you've become." Daniel also went to a jeweler and spent money he really couldn't afford on a simple silver bracelet with an engraving. Family isn't blood. It's who shows up. He had it gift-wrapped, his hands trembling as he handed over his credit card. The night before the flight, Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what he would say, how Margaret might react. Would she even recognize him? He was 28 years old now, tall and lean with the beginning of a beard. The scared 8-year-old boy she had taken in was long gone. What if the reality of who he had become disappointed her? What if he had built up this reunion in his mind so much that reality couldn't possibly match it? But it was too late to back out now. He boarded the plane the next morning, his worn journal in his carry-on bag. During the flight, he took it out and flipped through the pages. 20 years of his life documented in sketches and words. Every important moment, every struggle, every victory. And on the very first page, faded but still legible, Margaret's phone number and her promise. You will always have a home here, always. Keisha picked him up from the airport. When she saw him, she burst into tears and hugged him tight. Look at you, she kept saying. Just look at you. Mom is going to lose her mind. They drove through the old neighborhood, and Daniel was amazed by how much had changed, yet how much had stayed the same. The grocery store where he used to buy candy was now a coffee shop. The elementary school had been renovated. But the apartment building where he had felt safe for the first time in his life looked exactly as he remembered it. Keisha parked the car but didn't get out immediately. Daniel, I need to tell you something before we go up. Mom's been lonely since she retired. Her husband passed away about 10 years ago. It was a short marriage and they were happy, but he's gone now. She volunteers at a youth center, stays busy, but I can see she's missing something. Missing purpose. I think you coming back is going to mean more to her than you can imagine. They walked up the familiar stairs. Daniel's heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. They reached the door, the same door he had knocked on thousands of times as a child. Keisha pulled out her key, but before she could use it, Daniel stopped her. Wait, I want to knock. Like I used to. Keisha smiled and stepped back. Daniel raised his hand and knocked 3 soft taps. He heard movement inside, footsteps approaching. The door opened, and there she was, Margaret Williams. Her hair was gray now, her face lined with age, but her eyes were the same warm brown he remembered. She looked at him, confused at first, seeing only a tall stranger in a nice shirt. Can I help you? She asked politely. Daniel's voice broke as he said, Hi, Miss Margaret, it's me. It's Daniel. For a moment, Margaret just stared, not understanding. Then recognition crashed over her like a wave. Her hand flew to her mouth, and tears instantly filled her eyes. Daniel? She whispered. My Daniel? Yes, ma'am.